Hello, I hope you are doing well. My name is Jacqueline Vino from Golosso Learning Solutions, and welcome to the Genuine Learning blog. Today, we are going to discuss the ASB's new exposure draft on fraud. This proposed SAS would supersede AUC Section 240 and also amend various other AUC sections as well. This year, I had the opportunity to attend the AICPA's annual Engage conference in Las Vegas, and this topic was part of one of the sessions that I got to attend, and it was really great to get to hear some of this information firsthand. So I'm very excited that we now officially have an exposure draft on this. And there is a lot of information within this exposure draft. The entire thing is about 175 pages in total, so definitely not what I would consider to be a light read, but during this blog we are going to just hit some of the high notes and cover some of the background information and what are the key sections in the exposure draft as well, where we are going to see some of the changes. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive on in. So as you can see here, this proposed SAS is titled The Auditor's Responsibilities Relating to Fraud in an Audit of Financial Statements, and this was issued on July 2nd of this year. And there really are a couple of reasons why the ASB decided to take on this project. The first one is really to address some public interest issues that have been persisting for a few years now. There were a lot of questions about what the auditor's responsibilities actually are with regards to fraud in the audit of financial statements. So this exposure draft is really focusing in on what our responsibilities are as the auditor and what they should be. In addition to clarifying the auditor's responsibilities, though, this exposure draft also does recognize, of course, those broader efforts that are needed. So focusing not only on what our responsibilities are as the auditor, but also the roles of management, those charged with governance, and other individuals when talking about fraud. Now, aside from addressing the public interest, another thing that prompted the ASB to work on this was due to activity that was being seen from other standard setters, namely the ASB, so the international standards on this, as well as the PCAOB for auditors that work on public companies. So the ASB issued a revised standard on this in March, so just a couple of months ago. They had their own project on fraud, and the PCAOB also has this on their agenda as well. So we don't have a final standard from the PCAOB yet, but the Auditing Standards Board is continuing to monitor them to see when they're going to have some further developments on the project. Now, this is probably my favorite part of the entire exposure draft because I'm a very big nerd, but the ASB conducted a ton of research on fraud to determine how to improve the standard. So they undertook what was called a research synthesis project, and they looked at various academic studies between 2017 and 2022 to learn about the latest academic findings on identification, assessment, and responses to fraud risks. Now, in addition to academia, they also surveyed financial statement users and preparers, and they just wanted to get their perspectives as well. And there were a total of 134 responses that were collected to the surveys. And lastly, they also conducted a lot of interviews with preparers and users of financial statements back in fall of 2022, just to get some additional insights relating to these matters. So they surveyed and got responses from 134 people, and they also sat down and interviewed 26 individuals. So what I really like about this is that the ASB didn't just go in there and draft new guidance on fraud. They really dug in deep into what the issues actually are and what is really happening during engagements. So, doing lots of different things, doing the academic research, the interviews, the surveys. However, though, they did not just stop there. They also went ahead and interviewed 26 forensic professionals as well from firms of various sizes to learn what really works for them when they detect fraud. And these are folks that, they live and breathe fraud. These are, certified fraud examiners, and they offered lots of different recommendations that will hopefully be powerful insights for auditors. Now, what was one major theme that just continuously came up when they were conducting those interviews? They really determined that brainstorming needs to have a bit of a facelift. We need to go ahead and refresh some of those requirements. Forensic experts really suggested actually holding 2 sessions on brainstorming, one at the beginning of an engagement and then one at the end of the engagement. And also thinking about it more as a continuous conversation throughout the engagement as well. So they also recommended being a bit more inclusive with the discussions, not just limiting the discussion to key members of the audit team, but bringing on the whole engagement team into the discussion as well, trying to have some broader perspectives. They also emphasized the need for better guidance on the unpredictability of audit procedures as well. And that could mean, of course, using different procedures compared to what's been done in the past, maybe changing the timing of procedures, anything like that to keep fraudsters from really being able to guess what our next move is going to be. Data analytics is also a topic that came up a lot during these interviews. Forensic professionals really did urge us to think critically about the results of these different procedures and kind of where to go from there. What is the next step? Not just checking the box, but using data analytics to really prompt some real genuine curiosity as well. And speaking of curiosity, what was another key theme that kept coming up? And this should really come as no surprise to anybody, but auditors need to dig a bit deeper on this. This means asking follow-up questions, especially when something doesn't feel quite right. And with fraud inquiries, they also determined that fraud inquiries need to be led by more experienced staff members who really know what to listen for, and then have junior staff members kind of sit in and listen to learn and also to update that documentation. So more of a learning opportunity for them as well. And also suggested broadening who we speak to. That is another thing that came up. So don't just limit the inquiries to management, but also speaking to employees that are in operations, maybe speaking to vendors, and having these conversations to really just uncover some inconsistencies and also shed light on things. Corroborating inquiries, another thing that came up many, many times. We want to not just stop with inquiry. We always say inquiry alone is not going to be enough. So trying to corroborate what they say with documentation. They encourage even other stuff too, like being alert for what are some red flags in management's personal lives, major life events like financial stress, maybe some legal trouble that management is involved in, maybe personal issues like divorce, also red flags that we want to consider there. And just having all of these different recommendations. They also did mention having a deeper understanding for the whistleblower hotline as well. So if our clients do have whistleblower hotlines, understanding how those work, how they're being used, just to have that more robust understanding as well. So lots of different research went into drafting this exposure draft. Now, very importantly, what are some of the fundamental aspects of this exposure draft? First and foremost, it does keep, of course, the responsibility of management in preventing and detecting fraud front and center, but it now places the auditor's responsibilities first in the standard instead, to just clarify some of those expectations. So in essence, what they did to address this public interest issue was to change the order of how they appear in the standards. So auditors' responsibilities are now going to be first, then followed by management's responsibilities. And it also says that we are, of course, tasked with being alert to material misstatements that could potentially be caused by fraud. The proposal also emphasizes the need to maintain professional skepticism, reminding us to stay alert even later on in the audit as we get close to certain deadlines, and also to remain cautious even if we've had past positive experiences with management. We all know that story of Rita Crundwell in the city of Dixon, Illinois. Very, very sad story, but she is a great example of this. She didn't steal anything from the city her entire first 8 years of working there. But in the 9th year, she then started what would become the largest municipal fraud in the history of this country. So just because somebody hasn't committed fraud in the past, that doesn't mean that they're not going to start, in the future. And with regards to risk assessment, there is a whole section on this as well in the exposure draft. They also mentioned that rather than duplicating certain risk assessment procedures that are required in AUC Section 315, the exposure draft also strengthens these risk assessment procedures by applying a clearer fraud lens to them, and also requiring the engagement partner to ensure that the team has the right experience and also the right time to complete these procedures. So we have to consider all of these additional sources of fraud risk. We want to also have a retrospective review of all prior year estimates. That is another thing that this exposure draft clarifies. And to, of course, expand the engagement team discussion to consider fraud red flags, such as revenue recognition. So just trying to, once again, clarify and enhance what some of those requirements are. In addition, there's also another section on specifically fraud risk factors. So the exposure draft enhances the requirements for auditors to evaluate whether fraud risk factors are present based on our risk assessment procedures, and also it moves some supporting guidance to the application section for additional clarity. It also strengthens our responsibility to identify and assess fraud risks by aligning more closely with AUC Section 315 regarding the evaluation at both the financial statement level and, of course, at the relevant assertion level. So all fraud risk factors are still going to be treated as significant risks, and management override of control is now explicitly required to be assessed at the financial statement level. And if you work on audits, this is probably something that you're already doing, but they did want to specifically and explicitly require this in the exposure draft as well, just to make it a bit more formalized. The standard also is going to reinforce the presumption of fraud risk for revenue recognition, which again, a lot of engagement teams are probably already doing, and requiring auditors to consider fraud risk factors before identifying those more vulnerable areas. And then in addition to that, also emphasizes our responsibility to respond to these risks as well. So when we are identifying and assessing the risks, then we have to, of course, do the response to that risk, right? So and if you do audits, that is, AUC Section 315 and also 330. So we are going to have to design procedures that are open to contradictory evidence, that are objective, not just simply confirming what management's views are. So trying to reinforce our requirements there as well. Other sections of this exposure draft, of course, introduce more specific and structured steps for responding to identified or suspected fraud, requiring auditors to understand the nature and the circumstances, even if the fraud appears to be, minor, so to speak. So we have to, of course, document how the fraud was detected. We want to consider sources like whistleblower tips or other risk assessment procedures that have been performed. And then the engagement partner is also going to be required to evaluate that fraud's impact on the audit, unless it is clearly inconsequential. So additionally, though, what else do we have in this exposure draft? We have a standback provision that reinforces the need to assess fraud risk evaluations and ensure sufficient audit evidence has been obtained in the response, right? So we're going to have to do that, of course, standback provision there. And then finally, the proposed standard strengthens the expectations for ongoing, timely communication about fraud with management and those charged with governance, especially when key personnel are involved. And lastly, we have some additional documentation requirements, right? It would not be a new SAS unless we had some new documentation requirements. It also covers other matters such as fraud-related inquiries and asking those charged with governance if they are aware of any internal control deficiencies relating to fraud. And then it also makes amendments, of course, to various other SASs and AUC sections, including group audits and also getting written representation from management. So lots and lots of information, as you can see. So when is this proposed SAS going to become effective? So this is going to be effective for audits of financial statements for periods ending on or after December 15th of 2028. So we are going to get a little bit of time for this one. Also, if you are interested in commenting on this exposure draft, you are encouraged to do so by October 3rd of this year. So there is still a good bit of time if you are interested in commenting. Well, folks, that is all we have for today's blog. As you can see, there is just a ton of information contained within this exposure draft. But once again, my name is Jacqueline Vino from Golosso Learning Solutions. Thank you so much for tuning into this blog, and I hope to see you on future blogs. Thank you so much and have a great day.